No army was supposed to come from this direction. For the Roman Republic, the north was protected, not by walls, not by soldiers, but by something far more reliable. The mountains. The Alps were not just difficult terrain. They were a barrier so harsh, so unpredictable, that no major invading force had ever used them to launch a full-scale attack into Italy, which is exactly why no one was watching them. Rome didn't defend the Alps. They didn't prepare for an enemy there. They didn't even consider the possibility, because no one would be reckless enough to try. No one, except one man. Hannibal. He didn't choose the safest path. He didn't choose the fastest route. He chose the one place Rome believed it was impossible to be attacked. And that choice, that single decision, that would change the war before it even began. Hannibal understood something most commanders didn't. You don't defeat a powerful enemy by fighting the war they expect. You change the war entirely. Rome expected a familiar conflict, a naval engagement, a direct confrontation, a controlled escalation between two known powers. But Hannibal had already seen how that kind of war ended. It ended with Rome adapting, recovering, and eventually winning. So he refused to repeat it. Instead, he designed something radically different, a plan built on surprise, on unpredictability, on forcing Rome to react instead of control. The Alps were not an obstacle to him. They were an opportunity, a way to bypass Roman expectations, to avoid their strengths, and to appear where they felt completely secure. It was a decision filled with risk, one that could destroy his army before it even reached Italy. But if it worked, Rome wouldn't just be challenged, it would be shocked. The force Hannibal led into the mountains was unlike anything Rome was used to facing. It was not a single, unified army in the Roman sense. It was a combination of warriors from across different regions, hardened soldiers from Iberia, disciplined infantry from North Africa, and highly skilled cavalry units that would later become one of his greatest advantages. They were not trained the Roman way. They didn't rely on rigid formations or predictable tactics. They fought with flexibility, speed, and experience. Many of them had already seen war. They knew hardship. They understood what it meant to survive under pressure. But even for them, what lay ahead was something entirely different. Because this time, the enemy would not just be another army. It would be the terrain itself. And the only reason they continued forward, step after step, into something no army had attempted, was because they believed in one thing: their commander. The moment they entered the mountains, everything changed. The land became narrow, unstable, and dangerous. Paths that barely supported a single line of soldiers twisted along steep cliffs where a single misstep meant death. The air grew colder, visibility dropped, movement slowed, and suddenly, the campaign was no longer about strategy. It was about survival. The Alps were not passive terrain. They fought back. Loose rocks gave way beneath their feet. Ice formed without warning. Routes disappeared into fog and snow. And it wasn't just the land. Local tribes, familiar with the terrain, struck from above, launching ambushes at the most vulnerable moments. The army was constantly under pressure, not from one direction, but from all sides. Forward meant danger, stopping meant vulnerability, turning back meant failure. So Hannibal pushed forward, because once this path had been chosen, there was no alternative. As the march continued, the cost became impossible to ignore. Men slipped from narrow paths and vanished into the depths below. Animals lost their footing on frozen ground. Supplies were abandoned, not by choice, but by necessity. Every step forward came with loss. And with each passing day, the question grew louder. How much more could they endure? The cold drained their strength. The altitude slowed their breathing. The constant threat of attack kept them on edge. Exhaustion set in. Fear followed. This was no longer a march. It was a test of survival. And in moments like this, armies don't just weaken physically. They begin to break mentally. But Hannibal understood something critical. If the army lost belief, it wouldn't matter if they reached Italy. So he did what great commanders do under pressure. He kept them moving. He showed them a future beyond the mountains, because stopping here meant dying here. Among the soldiers moving through the mountains was something even more unexpected. Were elephants, massive, powerful, and completely out of place in such terrain. They were difficult to control, vulnerable to the cold, and nearly impossible to maneuver along narrow, unstable paths. Some were lost during the journey. Others struggled to continue. But those that survived carried a different kind of value. They weren't just weapons. They were symbols, proof that this army was not like any Rome had faced before. And when they eventually reached Italy, even a few remaining elephants would be enough to create shock, because for the Romans, this would not just be an invasion. It would be something unfamiliar, something unpredictable, something they had never prepared for. After days of loss, struggle, and constant danger, the army finally began its descent. The mountains that had once blocked their path now stood behind them. And ahead lay Italy. The cost had been severe. The army was smaller, weaker, tested in ways no training could prepare for. But it was still alive, still organized, still capable of fighting. And more importantly, it had achieved something no one thought possible. Hannibal had brought an army across the Alps, not as survivors alone, but as an invading force. And that single achievement changed everything. Because now, the war was no longer distant. It was here. While Hannibal fought his way through the mountains, the Roman Republic remained confident. They expected war, but not like this. Not here. Not now. And then the reports began to arrive. An army in northern Italy, not retreating, not scattered, advancing. What had once seemed impossible was now reality. The enemy had not only survived the mountains, he had used them. And in doing so, Hannibal had taken control of the war before the first major battle had even begun. Rome was no longer preparing for conflict. It was reacting to it. And as the reality settled in, one thing became clear. This was not going to be a normal war. If you want to see how this invasion turns into one of the most devastating defeats in Roman history, subscribe and watch what happens next.